even if you get a setback. Because most of the time, when someone has a subpar low self-esteem, anytime that they do something and they don't get the result they want, or it's a blow. But what I would say is like, no, it shouldn't be looked at as a blow. It should be looked at as a stepping stone for success. You're one step closer to where you were last time. So you're actually failing forward. Even though you may fail, it's feedback. It's giving you good information. Most of the inventors who may have invented important things may have failed hundreds of times. We're prototypes. And oftentimes when they're, asked, well, why did you fail? They say, I didn't fail. I just it was one step closer.
Hello, and welcome to episode 264 of the Quiet and Strong podcast, especially for introverts. I'm your host, David Hall. I'm the creator of quietandstrong.com. This is a weekly podcast dedicated to understanding the strengths and needs of introverts, along with strategies for success. Introversion is not something to fix, but to be embraced. Normally, we'll air each episode on a Monday. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite platform, leave a review or a rating. That would mean a lot to me and help others find the show. Tell a friend about the podcast and help get the word out there that introversion is a beautiful thing. Dr. Albert Bramante is a talent agent, performance psychologist, and mindset expert who has spent over 20 years helping high performers, both in the entertainment industry and beyond, conquer their mental roadblocks. With a PhD in psychology and certifications in hypnosis and NLP, he bridges the gap between talent, business success, and the psychology of peak performance. All right. Well, welcome to the Quiet and Strong podcast, Albert. Albert, it's so good to have you on today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here, David.
So, we're going to get into the work that you do, the book that you've written. Tell us a little bit about yourself first, your journey and to the work that you're doing now.
So the journey kind of started when I was a child. I was always very curious about the human mind and the brain, and I think, going with the theme of the podcast here, I was kind of the only, sort of being the youngest child of older brothers and sisters, and consider there was a larger age difference, like 8 years. I was kind of raised as the only child, and add that alone to the fact that I didn't really identify with my siblings. My family, my brothers and my father were all into sports. They lived, bred, sports. And for me, I had no interest and no ability. I couldn't, do it obviously, but I had no interest in both playing it, even watching it as a spectator. It really had no interest in me. So I think what I did down the line was I started turning to books. And I spent a lot of time in the library growing up, as a child and teenager. So I was reading a lot of books. Even by the time I was in high school, I was an avid reader. And I was reading sort of unconventional titles for a teenager, typically, such as, How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie. I was reading, Seven Habits of Highly Effective People. And then it was also one of my favorite books at that time was Feeling Good by David Burns, which was a primer on cognitive behavioral therapy. So, not your typical teenager reading material.
Hmm.
But I didn't have an outlet. Like now, I was involved in high school. I was involved in a lot of organizations, community service organization, service, debate club, drama club. And what really interested me was a drama club. That's what really interested me was, being involved in the drama club and being around actors specifically. That was what interested me was being around actors. And at that time, I really didn't know it. I didn't pay any mind to it. It was just more of an interest of mine. And then in college, I did take some acting classes to kind of get out of my shell a little bit. And it was fun. And that's all I looked at the time. This is fun, and I put it aside because I was still really determined to be a psychologist and to be a college professor. That's was my main aspirations from my sophomore year in high school all the way, pretty much until I had my master's degree. Now, when I had my master's degree, I found myself kind of on the ground working with 9/11. This is right because it's the same year that 9/11 had occurred, I had received my master's. And so some of my previous contacts and other internships had said, we need your help. So I kind of hit the ground running. I was helping doing some crisis intervention work. I also worked for, crisis hotline in New York City, providing entitlement for 9/11 survivors and families. So that was like primarily what I did. And in this time, I met some actors, I met some filmmakers, I met some directors. They asked me to audition for a movie because they have an interest in acting, okay? And I liked it. I didn't get that role specifically, but I've done other independent films. I've done some commercials. But kind of soon into the process, I realized that acting wasn't in my blood. I like being around actors and theater people, but it wasn't, something I wanted to do. But I still wanted to be in this environment. I think for me, and looking back at it and kind of being transparent, I think I felt seen and heard with these types of people. And I think that's kind of sort of like why I identify so much with theater and actors. I felt kind of heard and seen and understood and accepted. And I didn't quite feel that because I did, hang out with a lot of psychologists and other professors at different conferences, and I really didn't feel as comfortable. I could certainly hold my own. I mean, I could make discussions and symposiums, but for me, it wasn't fun. Like I didn't enjoy it, and I didn't feel really comfortable in these types of environment. I still don't. But it wasn't until that experience when I was, dabbling kind of in acting that I realized I liked working with actors. And so I shifted my gear to supporting actors. And that became being a talent agent or really a talent advocate. So that was sort of like my area of focus that became there. So that's when I became an agent in 2004, late 2004, early 2005. And so then I just started working as an agent. And that's how my journey started. Now, my journey into self-sabotage which is where I'm kind of like passionate about now. When I was starting my agency, I kept running into issues with actors that were engaging in self-sabotaging behaviors. And that what I mean by that is they would shoot themselves in the foot getting so close to a goal, but never would reach it. And I couldn't really explain why that was happening, but it was just something that I couldn't figure out what was really happening here. So I decided to do my dissertation on self-defeating behavior in performing artists. And that kind of required me to kind of do a deep dive into studying the psyche of the actor, the profile, the archetype of the actor. And so that's how that started. And that's kind of like led me to where I am now. And the doctoral dissertation was a great way to kind of merge both of my worlds and passions together, psychology with talent, representation, working with actors. So that was one of the good ways I found myself to really bring everything together.
Yeah, so you had had a desire to get your doctorate in psychology, correct? And then you achieved that, but you went and you've been a talent agent for quite some time, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, I've been doing this for several years, 21 years. I've been a talent agent.
And what drove you to still complete your goal of getting the doctorate in psychology?
What Well, it was always something I wanted to do. Like even since I was a sophomore in high school, my goal was to be a PhD. Now, in order to, at that time I wasn't too sure what I wanted to do. Initially, I was going to be a clinical psychologist. That was like my one track focus for many years. And in order to do that, you have to have a PhD. That's required. If you want to be considered a psychologist, you needed a doctorate of any form, but you needed a doctorate. And and like I said, and I wanted to be a full-time college professor. Also, another thing you needed a PhD for. So that was like my goal. Now, being that I was this thinker type and always a thinker and always a kind of like the bookworm, grad school was easy for me. It wasn't difficult. What was difficult for me and for most PhDs that I've talked to is the final stretch, dissertation. That's like the bane of every, PhD, a thorn, if you want to say, or the bane of every PhD's, existence. And that was mine too. I didn't realize this. I thought it was just going to be fun. It was a topic I liked, but it was something I've never done. It was, and it was worth it 100%. And that's what I think distinguishes what makes a PhD a distinguishable degree because of the amount of hard work that's required to do the dissertation. The coursework was a cakewalk for me. It was the actual time to do the dissertation that was a challenge for me. Plus, I had a lot I was juggling at the time, and so I was a psychology professor, and at that time, I had was hired full time where I was teaching at another college. So I had a full time professorship. I was trying to run a talent agent, and obviously complete a PhD, not an easy task to do. And kind of like I poured my heart and soul into teaching because I wanted to make a good impression, and it was my full time job. Now I was an adjunct for many years prior to becoming full time, but I can tell you one thing that there's a huge difference between being an adjunct and a full time professor. No, there's more classes, of course, but then there's also a lot of projects that you have to be a part of to service the college and and the community. So there was a lot of my time was being on the committees and community service projects for the college. So that took up a lot of my time, which is not what I should be doing if I want to get a PhD, like that, or run a business, So I would have to say for that 4 or 5 year period that I was like really immersed in a full-time job, the talent agency kind of just was just a thing. And my PhD just kind of went, out in the back burner. The unfortunate thing is I was still paying student, getting financial aid, so my student loan debt was accumulating through the roof. Now I found myself through some luck. Well, I say luck now. It didn't feel lucky at the time, but the job had ended, the full-time position. I wasn't granted tenure. The number of us weren't. So I found myself without a job, full-time job, which was a bit of adjustment, but it was also at a time I felt that was extremely necessary for me because now I can focus on my dissertation, finish the PhD, but also now devote my time into building the agency up. And that's exactly what I did. And once I kind of like licked my wounds from being let go, it was I was not in a very good place for a little while after that. When I was between the time of like noting I was going to be ending and then actually ending, I was not in a very good place emotionally because I got comfortable and I assumed I was going to be here for the rest of my life. But that was a necessary change I needed because I was able to complete my PhD and I was able to build my company up. So, but I think about quitting? A few times I did, that I thought, well, this PhD thing ain't worth it. And I'm really every day I'm glad I didn't, but at that time it just seemed like, it started to seem like a viable option. But, what stopped me was two things. Number one, I still would have to pay the student loan debt back. So, I might as well get something out of it now. And secondly, we can get a degree title, which is called an ABD, which is all but dissertation, which kind of is like a consolation prize, I feel like, this is just it wouldn't have meant anything. That's not a degree, that's not a title. So I was like, okay, you know what? Let me just do this, get it over with. Now I have the time, and I did. And then 2015, I would say in 2015, the biggest achievement was walking across the stage, being called doctor for the first time, and then getting robed, by the council, the university council. That was an amazing thing. I still have in a videotape. It was an amazing experience. So, and one of the greatest achievements of my life. So, and again, I'm thankful every day I've done it.
You opted, it felt the right thing for you felt like to be, do the talent agency? What made you decide to be an entrepreneur?
I always wanted to be an entrepreneur, I guess. You could say that. I think sort of like I enjoyed kind of like being on my own, and I like being on my own. I mean, yeah, there are some disadvantages. Sometimes it can be lonely a bit at times, and there's other expenses too. 'Cause, yeah, I have all those overhead that I'm solely responsible for. Now, I could have easily had applied to be an agency at someplace else, agent at someplace else. That there's a ton of, established agencies out there that I could easily have worked for. I think for me, the main reason to become an entrepreneur is that while I work well with people, I don't really like working for people. And I think sometimes, especially if somebody's an authority, if someone becomes an authoritarian, I get really uncomfortable. And I don't like it. And so that's sort of like one of the reasons why I think I shied away from working for someplace else. Now, yes, even though I'm teaching, I'm working for somebody else. At least the colleges I've taught at were very laid back. So as long as I was, showing up and teaching, they really kind of let me do what I want, which is what I really value. And don't think I would have gotten that if I worked for somebody else. I might have made a little more money. I might have had a little bit more security, but I know I wouldn't have been happy. And I like to be resourceful, which some employers may find that a little bit threatened, not too happy with, because I like to think outside the box, and which might not have been favorable by some employers. So I know that about me. But I think that's the main reason I want to be an entrepreneur is just to do something and be on my own.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, you work with a lot of introverts that are actors. And on
Hmm.
this show, we bust myths and we talk about strengths. What's a myth that you want to bust about introverts being actors?
Well, I think a lot of people get shocked when they find that most actors are introverts. I would say a good number of them. I would say probably much more introverted than extroverted, and I would
Okay.
say a good number of them.
I've heard that before. It's cool.
Yeah, a lot of it is the fact that they're performing for their art. So when they're up on stage or when they're in front of a camera, they're not doing it for the audience. They're not even paying attention to the audience. They're in their world playing a character, being creative. So they're in their mind and in their body when they're performing. So they're not doing it for the applause. You know, I've even had a lot of actors who tell me, because of the lights and everything when on stage, that they even forget the audience is there because they're so into like the other character and and just having that conversation, that dialogue that they don't even focus on the world around them. And I've even heard this a lot with musicians too. And I remember one podcaster I was talking to who's also a DJ and musician DJ, and he even a self-proclaimed introvert. And the one thing he says is like, a lot of times he might be on stage, they may be acting crazy and jumping around and yelling and because it was heavy metal, but it's not for the audience, it's their own artistic expression. And when it's performative, there's a character that you're playing. So you're not yourself. You're a character at the moment. And oftentimes, what a lot of people are surprised or even shocked is how the actor and the character that they're playing are completely different. I remember one time I saw a show one of my clients was in, and there was this other actor. He would play for a typical fraternity bro, very brash, very loud, and very, obnoxious type character. But when I talked, I walked up to him on the stage and was, and a bunch of people were telling me how great he was doing. He looked genuinely uncomfortable, and he was very soft-spoken. And he was actually even blushing, even and very calm. And some people were very, yeah, they were like shocked. They're like, "I don't understand." I'm like, "No, that makes perfect sense because he was playing a character. That's not him." And a lot of artists are like that. Like a lot of actors I know don't even like going to like clubs and bars or happy, hours. They don't like that. And you may think that for a myth, like, oh well, how can you not like that? You're always in front of people and all that. But no, it's not about the people. It's about your own inner world. And a good number of them are introverts. A good number of actors are introverted. And and I think a lot of times we get confused society with introverts and extroverts and that nature. Because a lot of people think that introverts are like, typically antisocial or anti thing. And that's probably the biggest myth out there
Yeah.
with introverts, that they're antisocial. They're not. They enjoy people just as much as extroverts do. It's just the amount and the context is different.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And yeah, there are antisocial people, but it's introvert is not the right word, you know? Or even
Yeah.
shy is not the right word because I know shy extroverts.
Oh,
Introvert, it means we're drawn inward more often than not, you know? What's a strength that introverts bring to acting?
well, one thing, a lot of introverts are right-brained, which means that they're more creative. And so they may bring a more intense intensity to a character, and depth to a character, imagination to a character. Some of them are great writers, and I think that's a strong strength that they bring is the creativity aspect of it. And that's important too, because what's also important to be successful as an actor, yes, I mean you're reading a script that somebody else has written, but there's a lot of depth that you can bring to a character, even though the dialogue may be sketch etched the same, but you can bring a dimension and creativity to the actor, to the role that the actor can bring to that role rather. And that is a strength because it's like there's a complexity that can be added, extra layers that, well, I didn't think of that. Well, that's a great tool.
Yeah. So let's get into your book, Albert. It's called Rise Above the Script: Confronting Self-Doubt and Mastering Self-Sabotage for Performing Artists. What caused
Hmm.
you to write that book and tell us what it's about?
So, well, I'm glad you asked. So, the book was kind of an extension of my doctoral dissertation, the foundation. So, the when I was first starting as an agent, I mean, we still see self-sabotage now, but I was running into this a lot, where a lot of actors would say they wanted to work, they would claim they wanted to audition, but anytime an audition came up, they would sort of shy away from it or run away from the project, and I couldn't understand why that was happening. I don't know why that was happening. And at that time I didn't. Now it makes sense, but there was a lot of fear that was happening. So a lot of times one of the things what a lot of industry people couldn't understand, what I mean industry people behind the scenes, casting directors, producers, directors, the one thing that no one could really understand, well, why were some of the actors being their own worst enemy? The field is already competitive enough, and it's like some of these behaviors are really taking the actors out of the running, before they even began. And so I think that was like something that was really, concerning me. And so when it came time to draft the topic for dissertation, the advice that we've got received in grad school was to pick a topic or answer a question, like frame it as a question that you're really passionate about. And my passion was what's up with these actors? Why are they self-sabotaging? And so that's what was kind of like the beginning, I could say. And then when I received my PhD, I did an actual study with actors and different, psychological tests that I'd given them. And so I became very interested in that. And when I published my PhD in the databases, my advisors had, encouraged me saying, "Hey, you should publish this. This is groundbreaking," because there was not a lot of work written, and at least professionally and scholarly, about actors, in this area of self-sabotage. And then, I'll be honest with you, I dropped the ball. I let it go for several years. And it wasn't until, I started thinking around 2020, 2021. really need to write this book because everyone kept asking me, tell me, you should write a book, you should write a book, you should write a book. Because I talk about this a lot. I was like, now, and and I was, you know, it was interesting because I was writing, I was living a lot of personally, out of the book, the themes I was writing about in my book. Gonna write about like this, the imposter syndrome and self-doubt. Because was thinking like, oh, well, these people are not going to want to read my book, and vice versa. No one's going to understand me, yada yada yada. And it just went on to I couldn't figure out a plan yet. And then it wasn't until like 2023 when I said, you know what, got to do this. I'm sitting, on, something I should be doing. And so that was kind of like where I wrote the book. And I was like, I really want to make this readable for actors and for other people. So I took the outline that I did for my dissertation and just, I took some of the research, added some newer studies in there and made it in a readable format. Because the thing about doctoral dissertations, they're great. I'm really happy with the work I've done, but nobody's going to read it unless they're a PhD in psychology. It's too dry and too boring, to be honest with you. Because, because what they did at my university, they bound it, they printed it, so it's like a book. And I remember my family and friends were like, "Oh, I want to read read your dissertation," and I would hand them the book, and they're like, after 2 pages, they're putting it down. I'm like, I get it because it's heavy. So I wanted to make something that because I felt like what I had to say was important, but I wanted to make it in a format that's interesting and user friendly. So that's sort of like where I did that in a sense.
All right. Well, let's get into the concepts. You talk about self-esteem, self-belief, self-worth. What's the difference between all these?
Well, self-esteem is a global, aspect of, evaluation of yourself. And then the other theme, part two of my book is on self-efficacy. And self-efficacy is your belief in it's more specific, like your belief in your ability to do something. So it would be like my thing, if I had self-efficacy, a good degree of self-efficacy would be for me being a professor would be I believe I can be a good professor. I believe I can be an effective professor, or I can be a good agent, or I'm a good agent. If I don't have that, if I don't believe I can be good, that's not going to help me out in any way. So being an actor, you have to believe in yourself, and believe in your ability and believe that the industry is fair going into it. Because if you don't, automatically your mindset is going to be ruined. In a sense, your mindset is going to be affected by that. So, and then self-esteem, again, is more global, like in general, how you feel about yourself. And it's an evaluation of yourself. And it's so important because if you have low self-esteem, obviously you're not going to be being that proactive. You're going to start using negative self-talk and talking yourself out of important opportunities. And then I make a distinction in my book. There's another problem with self-esteem, and that's when it's fragile but high, like toxic self-esteem, where people think that's where the arrogance and the pompousness and the hot-headed and comes in, and narcissistic comes in, grandiosity. And the reason why that I call that fragile is because it's easily broken. Because if you take people that are very arrogant or pompous or whatever you want to call that, and you challenge their, whatever they're arrogant about, they get very angry or they get very distraught, upset, and like kind of like thrown in an array. Now, if you're generally confident, somebody challenges you, you're going to almost welcome that challenge and point out, whatever it is that they're challenging you about and have an honest conversation. But if you are, the type of person that is, has this fragile high self, toxic high self-esteem, you're going to get very angry with anybody who challenges you. You're going to not listen to anybody who challenges you. Therefore, if somebody has any important information or important feedback to help you improve, coach you, whatever that is, you're not going to implement. And therefore, you're more likely to self-sabotage. So that was like really what I go over in parts one and two of my book. And then part three, I talk about personality factors and the big five, the five factor model in a sense. So I talk a little bit about that. And then I end the book, and the ending section is on fear of success and fears in general. And part of that is your relationships as well as your relationship with money. Because I have a whole chapter on like, your what's your relationship with money? Because I feel like that's important, really in this that needs to be met in this type of conversation. So that's pretty much the book in a nutshell. And I include in every chapter, I have a lot of research, studies that back, what I'm saying up, personal examples, and even some exercises to kind of like, or tips to kind of get you out of that role, out of that mindset.
Yeah, let's go back to when someone's lacking self-esteem or self-efficacy, how do they gain confidence? How do they raise their self-esteem or realize, yes, I can do this?
Yeah, well, the one thing, there's a couple of things that are important. Though the first thing to do is, to obviously we need to change the way you communicate yourself, the language you use about yourself, and that's the first thing. But also, what we need to do is get you to start taking action on doing things. So, small actions, just doing something different, stepping outside your comfort zone. And then the other thing you want to do is be mindful of your social circle. Like, who are you hanging out with the most, and do an audit of that, because if you're hanging out with people that are critical, judging, and just pessimistic, they're going to hold you down. But what you need to do is hang out with people that are going to build you up.
Yeah, and how do we what's some examples of the internal dialogue we should have when we're, building our self-esteem?
Well, the first thing is to reframing is important. Now, reframing is a tool that's often referred to in cognitive behavioral therapy, and that's changing, the outlook or changing a thought. So instead of saying, I can't, it's more of like, this is something I need to work on. Or, yeah, instead of saying the word try, use the word will. Instead of saying I'll try my best, I will do my best. Or reframing even failure as feedback, like even if you get a setback. Because most of the time, when someone has a subpar low self-esteem, anytime that they do something and they don't get the result they want or expect, it's a blow. But what I would say is like, no, it shouldn't be looked at as a blow. It should be looked at as a stepping stone for success. You're one step closer to where you were last time. So you're actually failing forward. Even though you may fail, it's feedback. It's giving you good information. Most of the inventors, who may have invented, important things may have failed hundreds of times. Or prototypes. And oftentimes when they're, asked, well, why did you fail? They say, I didn't fail. I just it was one step closer. I think it was either Ben Franklin or Thomas Jefferson had said, after one of their inventions, that it took, because someone's, asked him one time, it took you several hundred attempts. What did you do wrong? And he said, no, that was just several hundred clues to get to where I was going.
Right, right.
And I think that's where we have to start looking at, like, okay, you didn't get this, or you didn't get the job, or you didn't get the project, or this didn't go as planned. It's not the end of the world. It's actually a good thing, because now it gives you information and feedback that you can do to work harder the next time.
You probably deal with this quite a bit with the clients you work with, they probably can sometimes get feeling dejected like they didn't get this part or they didn't get this project like you're saying.
Yeah.
What's the good way to reframe that when it's rejection?
Well, I would say, one of the statements that I go by, and I read this in a book a long time ago. I don't know. It was just a quote in the book, so I can't really tell you who it came from. But it was like, "There's no such thing as rejection. It's just a simple reminder that your services are not needed today. So you didn't get that role. Okay, you didn't get the role. That's all this is. You're not right for that role. Let's try out tomorrow. And in this case, what that really means that no does not mean never. It's just not today, not for this role. And I
Yeah.
think sometimes we internalize when we get that no, like, oh, this is a disaster. I knew I was going to be a failure at everything. And it's like, no, it just means not right now. That's all this means. That all that no is just not right now, not today.
How do actors and other performers overcome stage fright?
Also, I'm going to kind of use the example of reframing stage fright.
Yeah.
So most of the time when what happens very often with emotion of fear is you get the physiological reactions, the butterflies in the stomach, the elevated heart rate, maybe the, elevation of body temperature, the sweating, and you start to think, oh, this is scary. I'm scared. That means I'm scared, and all of a sudden now you become fearful. Well, what if we switched it and looked at it like you're excited? Because almost the same exact stuff happens when you're excited. So it's like, no, you're not nervous. You're just excited to perform the role. Because I think it's unrealistic to tell someone that they're going to have no sensations when you're going up on stage. I think that's
Right.
almost impossible to tell somebody that. And yeah, it was interesting because I remember one of my first classes in college was speech. One of my first communication classes was speech class. And I remember even the first two chapters of the book were pretty much saying, if you're looking to get rid of stage fright completely, you're preaching to the choir. This is impossible. And even the best orators they were saying at that time, have the butterflies every time they go up to give a speech. They just know how to effectively handle it. So it's not necessarily like getting rid of stage fright, but working with stage fright by transforming it to excitement. So you're feeling this way because you can't wait to get on stage. You're feeling this way because you look forward to getting on stage. And that's
Yeah.
helped me out too when I just looked at it that way because you can actually use that adrenaline that you're building up initially to make you even do a better job performing.
Does reframing also apply to perfectionism?
Yes. Um, a lot of times perfectionism is going to hold us back because one of the statements I like that I really love that I heard just kind of this is like a cliche statement, but not ready is a lie that you're telling yourself. Because the thing about perfection is a lie. It's a myth. There's no such thing as perfect. So if you keep waiting for the perfect moment, it will never happen. So, not ready is a lie. So when people say like, "Oh, I'm not ready to do this yet. I'm not ready to go out and do this. I'm not ready to launch this business." That could be a lie most of the time. And usually when I talk to people, I'm like, "Well, what do you feel?" Well, I need to learn this and that. I'm like, "Well, why can't you launch or do whatever it is you want to do and still learn at the same time?"
Yeah.
Because that's the whole thing. Because if we sit there and we wait for the perfect moment, we've been waiting for a long time. And it's also linked to procrastination. Why we procrastinate? Because now is not the right time. It needs to be perfect. And a lot of times what you don't realize for a lot of people that are doing this is that there'll never be a right time. You just got to do it.
Yeah. Yeah. And one thing how I have talked about perfectionism in my internal dialogue is just like, I'm no actor, but I definitely like to give public speeches. And it's like, you know what? You're not perfect, but nobody listening is either, you know, and that's really
Yeah,
helped me.
of course. And nobody's perfect.
Yeah. So you said in the end of your book, you talk about the fear of success. What is that, and how do we overcome that?
The fear of success really is a lot of times the fear of change. That has a lot to do with it. It's the fear of change and what's the consequences. Because most people, when you talk about fear of success, they'll look at you like, what are you talking about? We're all chasing success. Yes, to a degree. But a lot of times if you become successful in whatever it is you do, you're so close but your life may change, and maybe We don't like change. As human beings, we don't like to be change. We don't like to change. So it's not necessarily it is fear of success, but it's fear to change that's going to be
Okay.
associated with that success. It could be a change of identity, a change in relationships, a change in everything. And we're so used to be comfortable in what we're doing that any time that we're going to be thrown into an upheaval, it's going to be scary.
Yeah. Albert, I have enjoyed diving into your book. There's so much great content in there, and we can't possibly cover it all. Is there anything else you want to say today about your book or anything on the work that you do?
Well, the one thing I will say, and I'll kind of end with this, is we all have the resources we need to be successful. Every one of us. It's just we sometimes lose the ability to do that. We lose the ability to tap into that. And what we need to do is to be able to tap into it. And so that's what's important, the
Yeah, well
ability to tap
said.
into it.
Yeah, well said on that. All right, Albert. Thanks again. Where can people find out more about you and your book?
Well, you could definitely check out my book on Amazon. It's Rise Above the Script, and it's available as an ebook as well as a paperback and audiobook. So you can get it on Spotify where major audiobooks are sold. And so I recommend that. I also connect with me on LinkedIn, under Albert Bramante, and I'd be happy to have conversations with you.
Sounds great. Thanks, Albert. Thank you so much for joining me. I appreciate you. I hope you take the time to explore other episodes and learn from other amazing guests. Remember, if you're interested in getting to know yourself better, there is now a free Type Finder personality assessment on the Quiet and Strong website. This free assessment will give you a brief report, including the four-letter Myers-Briggs code. I'll add a link in the show notes. And I'd love to connect with you. Reach out at david@quietandstrong.com or check out the quietandstrong.com website, which includes blog posts and links to social media for Quiet and Strong and much more. Send me topics or guests you would like to see on the show. So many great things about being an introvert, and so we need those to be understood. Get to know your introverted strengths and needs and be strong.